Please, steal it from me." Evelyn spoke those words slowly, her voice trembling and her eyes locked on the man sitting on the sidewalk. Caleb, a homeless man in dust-stained clothes with a wary gaze, blinked slowly, as if trying to determine whether this was a provocation, a delusion, or simply a senseless request. But Evelyn stood there, unmoving, holding a small bundle in her frail hands. "You need to take this from me. Before it's too late." It was a straightforward plea, yet there was something fractured in Evelyn's voice, something that made Caleb tilt his head without rising from the ground. He studied her intently. It wasn't every day that someone like her stopped to speak to someone like him. Evelyn didn't seem wealthy, but she also didn't appear desperate enough to beg a stranger to rob her. Her face bore the marks of time, her gray hair hastily tied back, and a scarf around her neck that looked too old to be a mere fashion choice. "Steal what?" Caleb asked, his voice low and dry, laden with exhaustion. He was used to strange requests, usually things like, "Get out of here," or "Don't touch that," but this one was entirely different. Evelyn extended the bundle toward him, her pale fingers clutching the faded cloth as if her life depended on it. "It doesn't matter what it is. Just take it. Please." Caleb folded his arms, resting them on his knees. He wanted to laugh or ignore her, but something about her expression gave him pause. That face didn't belong to someone who was crazy or dangerous. It was the face of someone carrying a burden so heavy it was crushing. "Why can't you just throw it away? Why me?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her voice barely audible as she answered. "Because this can't just be thrown away. I've tried. You wouldn't understand, but I need someone like you to take it. It's the only way I can move on." Her words were cryptic, and Caleb knew she wasn't just talking about the bundle. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something he wasn't used to seeing: vulnerability. It wasn't pity, nor was it a condescending gaze. It was the desperation of a woman begging for help, something he had felt countless times himself without ever finding anyone willing to extend a hand. And in that moment, before he could convince himself to refuse, Caleb reached out and took the bundle. He had no idea that what was wrapped in that faded cloth carried more than just a secret. It carried a story. Caleb held the bundle cautiously, as if it might explode at any moment. The cloth was old and faded, smelling faintly of mildew and dampness, but the object inside it felt nearly weightless. He glanced at Evelyn, trying to decipher what was happening. "Now can you tell me what's in here?" he asked, but his voice lacked demand. It was filled with curiosity, almost concern. Evelyn crossed her arms and looked away, as if the words were too difficult to say. She seemed older than when he first saw her, as if every second of their conversation was draining her. "It doesn't matter what's inside," she replied after a long silence. Just keep it away from me." Caleb squinted. He wasn't an idiot. People like her, well-dressed, with an air of someone who had family, friends, or at least a decent place to go, didn't go around handing mysterious packages to strangers. He turned the bundle over in his hands, feeling the folds of the cloth, trying to guess what might be inside. "If it doesn't matter, why don't you take it somewhere else? Why give it to me?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her answer almost a whisper. "Because you have nothing to lose." Her words cut through Caleb like a knife. He knew they were true, but hearing them spoken aloud by someone who barely knew him hit him harder than he expected. He gripped the bundle tighter, trying to ignore the sudden ache in his chest. "And you? What are you losing?" he shot back, meeting her gaze. She bit her lip, looking as though she was on the verge of breaking down. "Everything," she answered. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back with sheer determination. "I've lost everything I had, everything that made me alive. And this object, it's all that's left." The silence between them was almost unbearable. Evelyn seemed fragile, yet there was something about her that hinted at immense strength, a strength that was nearly spent. Caleb wasn't the type to ask questions, but this situation was different. Something about this woman, about the bundle now in his hands, made him feel like there was more at stake than he could understand. Why does this hurt you so much? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Evelyn sighed, as if she had been carrying that story for so long she didn't know where to begin. Because every time I look at it, I remember what I did. What I failed to do. Caleb said nothing. He understood the weight of regret. He understood what it was like to look at something and be reminded of what you lost. As Evelyn stepped back slightly, as if she needed air, Caleb felt the cloth in his hands and, on impulse, began to untie it. No! Evelyn nearly screamed, spinning around to face him with a look of panic. Don't open it. Not now. Her outburst stopped him cold. He didn't know what was inside, but from her tone, he understood that this object meant far more than he could imagine. Evelyn was breathing heavily, her face flushed. Just, keep it. Away from me. And with that, she turned and began to walk away, leaving Caleb sitting there, clutching the bundle, his mind racing with a million questions. Caleb sat on the sidewalk for long minutes, watching Evelyn walk away with hesitant steps. She glanced back only once, as if to ensure he wouldn't open the bundle. Her face bore a mixture of relief and anguish, like someone who had just said goodbye to a piece of themselves. Caleb kept his eyes on her until she disappeared into the crowd, feeling the weight of the small object in his hands grow heavier, like a stone. He stared at the bundle, which now seemed to throb with the mystery it held. It wasn't much bigger than a book, but the cloth was tied so tightly it seemed to guard something valuable, or dangerous. Caleb knew he should honor Evelyn's request, but curiosity gnawed at him. Who handed something so strange to a complete stranger? And why was it unbearable for her to keep it? The noise of the street pulled him back. People hurried past, as usual, avoiding him. Caleb rose slowly, adjusted his tattered coat, and clutched the bundle to his chest. He decided to find a quieter spot, away from prying eyes, to figure out what he was supposed to do. He headed to an alley where he often slept on colder nights. The space was cramped but sheltered from the wind, its walls stained and reeking of damp garbage. There, Caleb sat on the ground and rested the bundle on his lap. His fingers traced the rough fabric as he thought of Evelyn, her devastated face, and the weight in her words. Finally, he decided to untie the bundle. Carefully, he loosened the knots, feeling the cloth give way. Inside was something that made him pause, a photo album. Its brown leather cover was worn with age, and the clasp was barely holding together. Caleb opened it hesitantly, the faint scent of old paper and dust rising to meet him. The first photo was of a smiling family. Evelyn, younger and with dark hair, stood beside a tall man and two children. They all looked happy, their eyes shining as though the moment captured was perfect. Caleb ran his fingers over the image, not realizing he was holding his breath. He turned the page. The next photos showed the same group, but time had taken its toll. The children grew older, the man appeared more tired, and Evelyn had lost her smile somewhere along the way. One photo, in particular, made Caleb stop, Evelyn cradling a baby in her arms, her face partly obscured by shadow. There was no joy in that image, only something Caleb immediately recognized: pain. The following pages were blank. Only yellowed paper remained, with faint traces of glue where more photos had once been. Caleb closed the album and looked at the faded cloth beside him. He understood that what Evelyn had carried wasn't just an object. It was the weight of a story she could no longer bear. And now, he carried it. As Caleb held the photo album, something inside him shifted. It was as if the images awakened memories he had long tried to bury, fragments of a life he avoided revisiting. He closed the album gently, but the symbolic weight of the object was crushing. Why does she want to get rid of this? He murmured to himself, as though the album might answer. Caleb knew there was something deeper to the story. The album wasn't just a collection of old photos, it was a reflection of something Evelyn was running from. He leaned back against the cold wall of the alley and gazed up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Maybe it was just an album, he thought, but the desperation in her eyes said otherwise. Across the city, Evelyn walked slowly along the sidewalk, as if each step was a struggle. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ground. Now that the album was no longer with her, she should have felt relieved. But she didn't. Instead, an emptiness grew in her chest, as though something had been ripped from her. She stopped in front of a small cafe, staring at her reflection in the window. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. There was Evelyn, a grandmother, a wife, a mother, or at least, that's what she was supposed to be. She ran a hand through her gray hair, trying to push back the memories flooding her mind, but it was no use. The photo album had been her last connection to the daughter she had lost. Years ago, Evelyn made a mistake she could never forgive herself for. She knew it every time she looked at the final photo in the album, the one where she held the baby in her arms. The child had been only a few weeks old when Evelyn made an impulsive decision, an act that seemed necessary at the time. But that act had haunted her ever since. Evelyn had never been able to forgive herself. The blank pages in the album were a painful echo of the things she had never had the courage to face. She had kept those memories for decades until the pain became unbearable. Giving the album to Caleb was her last attempt to free herself. But now, without it, Evelyn felt exposed, as though her truth would follow her wherever she went. Meanwhile, Caleb remained seated in the alley, the album resting on his knees. He knew he should get rid of it. That's what Evelyn wanted, after all. But something stopped him. He had seen pain before, the pain of the streets, of loss, of abandonment. But what was in that album wasn't ordinary. It was something different, something that spoke directly to his own feelings, like an echo of his own failures and regrets. Though he didn't know who Evelyn truly was or why the album mattered so much, Caleb decided he couldn't simply discard it. Something inside him told him it still had a purpose. And even without knowing exactly what to do, he resolved to find out. Evelyn returned home that night, but the word home seemed to have lost its meaning. It was a small apartment on the third floor of an old building, with peeling walls and furniture that carried decades of history but little life. She opened the door slowly, as if expecting the silence inside to swallow her whole. The place felt emptier than ever. She walked to the living room and sat on the creaking sofa. On the coffee table in front of her sat a mug, still stained from her morning coffee, but she felt no urge to clean anything. Her eyes wandered to a framed photograph on the shelf, a faded image of her daughter as a teenager, smiling brightly with sparkling eyes. Evelyn picked up the frame carefully, her fingers sliding over the glass. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. On the other side of the city, Caleb was still in the alley, staring at the album like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. He didn't know why, but he felt he couldn't simply abandon the object. The photos inside spoke of a family that seemed happy, yet there was an unmistakable sadness woven into that happiness. The empty pages disturbed him. It was as though Evelyn had ripped out those memories on purpose, leaving the empty spaces as a constant reminder of what was missing. Caleb flipped the cover again, his eyes lingering on the photo of a younger Evelyn holding a baby in her arms. The expression on her face was impossible to decipher. He recognized that blend of emotions, love and pain coexisting, two forces that cancel each other out yet feed off one another. Slowly, he began to wonder what had happened. Why had Evelyn chosen him? Why did that album weigh so heavily on her? Caleb had his own scars, the kind left by the streets and time. He understood what it meant to carry something that seemed impossible to let go of. Maybe that was why he couldn't ignore what was now in his hands. While Caleb tried to organize his thoughts, Evelyn stood from the sofa and walked to a locked drawer in the corner of the room. With trembling hands, she pulled a small key from her coat pocket and opened it, revealing a collection of objects she hadn't seen in years. Among them was a silver children's bracelet, engraved with the name Lily in tiny letters. Evelyn held the bracelet as tears welled up in her eyes. She knew she had reached her limit. For decades, she had tried to move on while carrying the weight of her decision. But with each passing year, each forgotten birthday, the regret piled up. And now, after giving the album to Caleb, she felt she had shifted the responsibility elsewhere, but the pain still lingered, embedded deep within her like a thorn she couldn't remove. Caleb looked up at the dark sky and decided he couldn't stay still. He tucked the album under his arm and left the alley. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he needed to find Evelyn again. Something about her connected him to what he had lost. And even though he didn't fully understand what that meant, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Caleb walked through the city with uncertain steps, the album held tightly under his arm. The night was cold, and the wind bit at his uncovered hands, but he hardly noticed. His mind was consumed by the images he had seen, by the faces frozen in those photographs. Evelyn and her family. The smiles of children he had never met but who now seemed to be calling him to something greater. He knew he needed to find her again, not just to return the album but to understand. To hear the story Evelyn couldn't bring herself to tell. As he walked through dimly lit streets, memories of his own life surfaced like an unstoppable current. Caleb knew what it was to lose everything, to be consumed by regret. There were days when he wished more than anything to forget, to erase the past and start over. But, like Evelyn, he knew some memories could never be abandoned. Across the city, Evelyn sat on the floor of her living room, her face buried in her hands. The silver bracelet lay beside her, faintly glinting under the lamp's light. Her thoughts returned to Lily, her daughter. The baby she had cradled with love but never got to raise. Lily was the result of a relationship Evelyn had tried to hide from the world. She had been young, vulnerable, and convinced that the best choice for her daughter was to give her to another family. It's for her own good, people around her had said. She'll have a better life than you can give her. But as the years went by, the weight of that decision grew like a shadow. Evelyn didn't know who Lily had become or even if she was alive. The emptiness was unbearable, and the album, filled with photos of her fleeting moments with her daughter, was both a comfort and a torment. Caleb reached a small park where he often spent the night near a lake. He sat on a bench and opened the album again, turning the pages slowly, as if each image carried a secret he needed to uncover. When he reached the last photo, Evelyn holding Lily, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a handwritten inscription in the bottom corner, nearly faded with time. To Lily, with all the love I could never say. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He closed the album tightly and took a deep breath, a lump forming in his throat. He thought about Evelyn, about the pain she carried, and realized that the object in his hands wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a cry for help. He looked out at the lake, its surface reflecting the faint city lights. Evelyn's pain now felt far too close to his own. He understood what it meant to hold on to regret, to feel like wrong choices had destroyed everything that mattered. Caleb knew that, somehow, he needed to find a way to help Evelyn, even if he didn't yet know how. Evelyn spent the night awake, sitting on the floor of her living room, clutching the small bracelet in one hand and her daughter's framed photograph in the other. The hours dragged on unbearably, and with each passing minute, the emptiness inside her seemed to grow. Giving the album to Caleb had felt, for a brief moment, like a release. But now, without it, the regret had returned, stronger than ever. She wondered if he had opened the bundle, if he was looking at those photos and judging her for her choices. Or worse, perhaps he had discarded the album somewhere, indifferent to the pain she had entrusted to it. Evelyn knew she shouldn't expect understanding. How could anyone understand when she couldn't even forgive herself? Meanwhile, Caleb stood by the edge of the lake, still holding the album. The night had grown colder, but he hardly noticed. He couldn't stop thinking about the inscription on the photo, "To Lily, with all the love I could never say." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight Caleb knew all too well, the kind of love that arrives too late, the kind of regret that suffocates. Caleb knew he had to find Evelyn. He needed to understand more than the fragments the photos revealed. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, as if her story was tied to his own in a way he couldn't yet grasp. He began wandering the streets without a clear destination, determined not to give up until he found her. Back in her apartment, Evelyn did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out a sheet of paper and a pen and began to write. Her hand trembled as she put words to the page, but she didn't stop, even as each sentence seemed to tear something from within her. Lily, my sweet girl. I've never been able to tell you how sorry I am. Every decision I made, I thought it was for the best, for you. But deep down, I know I failed. I should have fought harder, should have stayed by your side no matter what. But I was weak. And that weakness cost me you. I don't know where you are, or who you've become. I don't know if you think of me, or if you'd rather forget. But wherever you are, I want you to know that I loved you. I've always loved you. Even when I let you go. Tears smudged the ink, but Evelyn didn't stop. She needed to let it out, even if the letter would never reach anyone but herself. As Evelyn poured her heart onto paper, Caleb wandered the city, retracing what he imagined might have been her steps. He asked strangers, described her face to a shopkeeper, even to other homeless individuals, but no one seemed to know her. His hope was beginning to waver when he turned a corner and saw something that made him stop. It was Evelyn. She was sitting on the same park bench where he had first seen her. She looked even smaller now, her shoulders slumped, her gaze distant. Caleb tightened his grip on the album and walked toward her. You were right, he said as he approached. I don't have anything to lose. But from what I've seen here, he lifted the album. Maybe you don't either. Evelyn looked up slowly, surprise flashing across her face as she saw Caleb standing there. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a flicker of something resembling hope. Evelyn's eyes met Caleb's, and for a moment, she seemed unable to believe he was really there, standing in front of her with the album held like a precious artifact. There was something in his gaze that caught her off guard, a mix of determination and compassion she hadn't expected to find in a stranger. Why did you come back? She asked, her voice still hoarse from a sleepless night. Caleb took a deep breath, as if choosing his words carefully. He sat down on the bench beside her, placing the album between them. I don't know exactly what happened to you, but when I saw these photos, I felt like I had to come back. Not just to return this, but because I don't think anyone should carry something like this alone. Evelyn averted her gaze, tears stinging her eyes. You don't understand, she murmured. This album isn't just memories. It's the weight of everything I did wrong. Every empty page, it's a reminder of what I destroyed. Caleb studied her closely, noticing the faint tremors in her hands and how close she seemed to breaking. He realized he needed to share something of his own, something that might bridge the gap between them. I know what that's like, he began, his voice low but steady. I lost someone too, someone I was supposed to protect. My sister. She was 9 when she got sick. I thought I could take care of her, that I'd figure it out somehow. But I failed. She's gone now, and all that's left are the memories. And a million unanswered questions. Evelyn turned to him, startled. For the first time, she saw Caleb as more than just a stranger. He, too, carried his own pain, his own invisible scars. You've been holding on to that all this time, she asked, her voice softer now. Caleb gave a small, almost bitter smile. Still do. But looking at this album, it made me realize something. Maybe I'm not the only one. He pushed the album toward her gently. This isn't just a weight, Evelyn. It's an opportunity. A chance to remember, maybe even to fix something. But you have to want to. Evelyn sat in silence, her hands resting on the album but too afraid to open it. She knew Caleb was right. For years, she had avoided those memories, convincing herself that forgetting was the only way to survive. But now, everything seemed clear. Running was impossible. "I had a daughter," she began, breaking the silence. "Lily. She was so small, so perfect. But I wasn't ready to be a mother. I thought I was doing the right thing. I gave her to another family. And I never found out what happened after." Caleb listened intently, not interrupting or looking away. Evelyn was finally sharing the burden that had consumed her, and he knew it wasn't easy. "And now," he asked gently, "if you could see her, talk to her, would you?" Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I'd give anything for that. But, what if she doesn't want to see me? What if she hates me for what I did?" Caleb rested his hand lightly on the album, as if to underline his point. "You'll never know unless you try. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that regret weighs far more than the truth." His words hung in the air, and Evelyn knew he was right. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance for redemption. Evelyn remained motionless for a long time, her hands firmly resting on the album as Caleb's words echoed inside her. Regret weighs more than the truth. He was right. She had known it for a long time but had never mustered the courage to face what it truly meant. The park was silent, with a crisp breeze carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. Evelyn took a deep breath and looked at Caleb. In that moment, he seemed younger, almost vulnerable, like someone who had finally found a reason to keep going. "I'm scared, Caleb," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Of looking into her eyes and seeing rejection. Hatred. Or maybe worse, indifference. I don't think I can bear that." Caleb leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the ground before responding. "I've lived without answers. Believe me, that's unbearable too. At least if you try, you'll know you did everything you could." He paused, then added softly, "And I don't think she would hate you. Not if she understands why you did what you did." Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to process his words. Memories of her daughter as a small child played in her mind like a vivid, cruel film. The sound of her laughter, the scent of her skin, every detail seemed sharper than ever. But the memory that overshadowed them all was the day she gave her away, the crying, the child's confused face, and the promise Evelyn had never been able to keep, that she would come back for her. "Do you think it's possible?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet Caleb's. He seemed like her last lifeline. "That I could find my daughter?" Caleb offered a small, bittersweet smile. "I'm not the best person to answer that, Evelyn. But sometimes, things have a way of happening when you decide to try." His words lit a spark within her, a mix of fear and determination that she had carried for so long it felt like part of her. But now, with Caleb beside her, she felt that maybe she could take the first step. She pulled out the letter she had written earlier, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the album. Then she turned to Caleb. "I want to do this. I want to find her. But I can't do it alone." Caleb blinked, surprised. "You want my help?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening with a determination he hadn't seen in her before. "You said you know what it's like to carry regrets. I need someone who understands. Someone who can remind me to keep going, even when I feel like giving up." Caleb hesitated for a moment, but he knew he couldn't refuse. He had spent years running from his own pain, but perhaps helping Evelyn was the only way to confront his. He extended his hand to her. "Then we'll do this together." Evelyn took his hand, and for the first time in years, she felt that she wasn't completely alone. The days that followed were a mix of tension and hope for Evelyn and Caleb. Seated side by side at the city's public library, they scoured records, cross-referenced information, and made phone calls that always seemed to lead to dead ends. Evelyn had Lily's full name, but the family who adopted her had left few traces. Still, she clung to that thin thread of hope like someone refusing to sink, even as the water rose higher. "Have you thought about what you'll say to her?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence as he typed on a borrowed computer. Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. "I've rehearsed it in my head for 30 years. But now that the possibility of seeing her is real, I don't know." Caleb glanced at her. "Just tell her the truth. No matter how she reacts, at least she'll know you tried." His words echoed in the quiet library. Evelyn knew he was right, but fear still consumed her. "What if she doesn't want to hear me?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Caleb set the keyboard aside and turned to face her. "Then you accept it. But at least you won't spend the rest of your life wondering, what if?" On the third day of searching, a lead finally emerged. Caleb found a recent marriage record in a nearby town with Lily's name listed as one of the witnesses. Evelyn didn't know whether to cry or smile. It wasn't definitive, but it was the closest she had come to her daughter in decades. "It's her," Evelyn said, her voice steady even as her eyes brimmed with tears. "Then this is it," Caleb said, tucking the album under his arm. "We'll find out the rest in person." The bus ride to the town was quiet, filled with moments where Evelyn gazed out the window, lost in thought. Caleb, seated beside her, held the album carefully, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. He knew it was more than just an object, it was the bridge between Evelyn's past and present. When they arrived at the address, Evelyn hesitated on the sidewalk. The house was simple, with a small garden and neatly tended flowers. "What if she's not here?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. "Then you try another day," Caleb replied without hesitation. "But you're here now. That's more than you ever imagined doing." Evelyn took a deep breath and walked up to the door. With each step, her heart pounded harder, as if trying to escape her chest. She raised her hand to knock but hesitated. Caleb, standing a few paces back, watched her silently, ready to support her but not interfere. When the door finally opened, Evelyn was met with the sight of a young woman. Her long hair and eyes were a near-perfect reflection of Evelyn's own. The woman frowned slightly, confused. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. Evelyn tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she opened the album and showed the photo of herself holding the baby. I'm your mother." The silence that followed felt eternal. The young woman looked at the photo, then back at Evelyn. Her eyes began to glisten with tears, but she said nothing. Finally, the woman stepped back and opened the door fully. "Come in. Let's talk." Evelyn glanced back at Caleb, who gave her a small, encouraging smile and nodded, as if to say everything would be okay. She stepped inside, feeling for the first time in years that forgiveness, both from Lily and herself, might finally be within reach. The living room was simple, furnished modestly, with walls adorned by photographs of moments Evelyn didn't recognize. She stepped inside cautiously, clutching the album tightly against her chest as if it were a shield. Lily, the woman before her, seemed just as confused as she was vulnerable. They stood there in silence until Caleb, standing outside, gently closed the door, leaving them alone. Evelyn sat at the edge of the couch, her hands trembling slightly. Lily remained standing, her eyes fixed on the album Evelyn held. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. Finally, Evelyn took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her words halting and strained. "At the time, I thought I was doing what was best for you. But every single day since, I've wondered if you were okay, if you were happy. And every single day, I've hated myself for not being strong enough to stay by your side." Lily, tears forming in her eyes, slowly sat down in the armchair across from Evelyn. "I wondered about you too," she replied, her voice breaking. "My mom, the woman who raised me, she was amazing. But she always told me that there was someone out there who loved me enough to let me go. The words hit Evelyn like a punch to the chest. She tried to hold back her tears but failed. She was right, Evelyn said. I loved you so much that I thought you deserved better than what I could give. But I was wrong. I realized it too late. And now, all I want is for you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Lily looked at Evelyn, studying every line on her face, every detail. I don't know how to feel right now, Lily admitted, her voice raw. I thought about you my entire life. Sometimes with anger, sometimes with sadness. But seeing you here, I think what I feel is gratitude. You gave me a chance to have a life. And now you're here. Maybe this can be a new beginning. Evelyn felt the heavy weight she had carried for so long start to dissolve. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Lily. But if you'll let me, I'd love the chance to get to know the incredible woman you've become. Tears streaming down her face, Lily did something unexpected. She stood and opened her arms. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before rising as well. When they embraced, time seemed to stop. It was a long hug, filled with emotions that had been bottled up for years. It was a hug that spoke louder than any words could. Outside, Caleb waited, gazing at the quiet street. He had done his part, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, peace. He knew that by helping Evelyn reconnect with her daughter, he had also found something he hadn't realized he was searching for, a purpose. When Evelyn stepped out of the house later, Lily by her side, Caleb noticed the change. The face that had been etched with regret now held a faint glow of relief and hope. Thank you, Evelyn said to Caleb, holding his hand for a moment. I couldn't have done this without you. Caleb smiled, a genuine and calm smile. Sometimes, we just need someone to believe it's possible. If you want to see more heartwarming stories like this, comment, I want, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Stay tuned for another emotional story coming up next.